good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator. Joining us is Ben Trumbore, a researcher and computational scientist for the Cornell Center for Advanced Computing. Ben also happens to be the faculty author of our Data Visualization in Tableau program. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Always great to have you. And just very quick, audience, we want our conversation to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to drop some of your questions there in the viewer chat. We'll be fielding them kind of throughout our conversation, and we'll be answering as many as we can as time allows. We'll also be dropping some links in there as well. So please make sure to click on those as well. And again, we appreciate your comments and questions as well, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So Ben, I want to kind of start off with this idea of, data visualization and everything like that. So really, my first question is, what is data visualization?
Well, it's, I guess, in effect, the process of turning numbers and other information into something visual that your brain can process in a different way. Mm-hmm. You could take a table full of numbers and show it to someone, but they're going to have a hard time seeing the patterns in it, seeing the outliers. Whereas if you lay that out in a chart, those things really jump out at you. Your brain is made and evolved to identify these strange patterns and things that you might be able to take advantage of. Going back to the days when we were searching for food or being wary of predators, we notice patterns and try to take advantage of them.
And just real quick, I want to know, is there in a short answer, is there a favorite chart or favorite graphic or anything that you've seen recently that really has jumped out to you?
I can't think of one off the top of my head. I think that sometimes the ones that are most meaningful to me is they're just very concise and simple. They're not flashy, but they get right to the point, and no one had to explain them to me, and I understand them. So when I see those, I'm really appreciative of it.
I definitely have to say one that's jumped out to me was, I'm a big football guy. I know you're a big football guy as well. Is with football season coming up, I know they always do the graphics and visuals with passer completions and things like that, and short, medium, and long throws, and I love that. It's so fascinating. But with attention spans really getting shorter and shorter, why is really getting your point across quickly and effectively, especially when it comes to, large data sets, so important, especially in today's world?
Well, I think you have a good point there, that people don't want to spend as much time looking at something, and you really need to get a hold of their attention very quickly, which in some senses is focusing your chart-making efforts on doing the right thing. I think the tendency has been over many years to put too much into a chart, and it's hard to consume. Whereas if you have a series of charts, each one which is focused on one aspect of what you're trying to convey, those are easier to understand. You could actually put those charts in front of someone without telling them what they're about. And if they're well made, the person can tell themselves the story that comes from those charts. So in a sense, it may be making us more disciplined at making better charts.
Mm-hmm. And I'd be interested to know, is that a problem that you see often, that people spend too much time on, too many visuals instead of kind of trying to simplify them?
It's actually a really important step, and I go through this in the course. Mm-hmm. If you have things in there that the person is going to see, they're naturally going to want to understand them. And they might spend time looking at things that do not contribute to the message you're trying to send with this chart. And so if you eliminate those things, decluttering the chart is a term that's often used, you can really get them to focus more quickly on the thing that's important.
Mm-hmm. And, with that in mind, I'd be interested to know, what are some key principles of effective data visualization?
Well, that's a good question. It may not be easy to answer with a single sentence, but what you really need to do is start off with a strong idea of what you want the chart to say. What is the message that the chart is going to send? And you also need an understanding of the data that you're going to use to make the chart. What types of it? Is it categorical information or numerical information or date information,
Hmm.
and what types of relationships between different parts of the data are you hoping to portray. And if you don't stop and plan that part of it out before you begin making a chart, you're just going to be wandering around in the woods, so to speak. So
Hmm.
that's the way you need to think about it first.
Hmm.
And I'll say this, that although visualization software has gotten a lot better over the years, it's more
Right.
powerful and also easier to use. It
Hmm.
cannot read your mind and decide what to do for you, because you have to begin with an idea of which direction you're heading in, and then the software will help you go in that direction.
Hmm. And I'd be interested to know just, quickly, how have you seen that kind of technology grow? Like you said, it can't read our minds, but the technology has improved. How have you, seen it change and kind of grow over time?
Well, that's a good example. I think that I've used Excel charts for many years
Okay.
because often I've got the data already in an Excel file,
Hmm.
and in the old days, the default chart that you would make would often be kind of unattractive. And they've really cleaned that up. And I think most of the other products have as well. You're going to be given colors that look nice together. You're going to be given fonts that are legible and so forth.
Hmm.
So unless you start messing around with it, the floor for your chart is probably a lot higher than it used to be. And then
Hmm.
on the other end, with products like Tableau, there is powerful scripting and equations you can put into it, combining data in complex ways that allow you to do things you never would have been able to do years
Hmm.
before. Now that stuff isn't necessarily easy, but it's in there if you need it.
Hmm.
And in between, I guess, is where a product like Tableau, if you drag a couple bits of your data into the chart area and say this is the data I want to work with,
Hmm.
it knows what types of data that is. Is it a date field of your data, or is it some other number, whatever? And it will look at the different types of charts it can make and limit the selection for you to make to those that are appropriate for the data. And that's a big help because it cuts away some of the things that are going to be dead ends. And so that's a big assist to people who really don't know which direction to go in.
And with that, I'd be interested to know, you mentioned, with Excel and, some of these programs that the graphics have kind of grown over time. But you also mentioned, obviously with, programs like Tableau, they can't read our minds. So as a follow-up, how can we choose the right chart or graph for the different types of data that we might run into or utilize?
That's I'm glad you asked that. In fact, I've brought some slides to show some examples. Many people in the field think of the different types of charts in four different categories:
Hmm.
uh, comparison, composition, distribution, and relationship. And when I say those, maybe that doesn't mean anything. But if I show some examples of the charts, maybe people will get an idea. And we go through all of these in some detail in the course.
Hmm.
In the comparison category, which is one of the most common types of charts, you're allowing people, the viewer, to compare numerical data over multiple categories, let's say. So here's an example of the orange production in Spain over a number of years. And you'll probably recognize the column chart. This is a great way to speak directly to your brain. Your brain is very good at seeing the sizes of those columns and getting an idea of how much bigger one is than the other. That's the chart on the left. And then we only have 6 years worth of data there. If you start to have quite a few bits of data, then you probably don't want to show a bunch of skinny little columns. You might switch to another type of comparison chart, a line chart. So it's showing the same thing over more years, and it's just doing it with lines instead. And if I can advance to another dimension of that type of chart,
Hmm.
here we're looking at data values over time, so we're using the line chart, but we have multiple different lines in the chart, each one representing the production of oranges in a different European country.
Hmm.
I have a little example here of how you can make it easier for the viewer to get a quick understanding of the chart. In the left example, we have a legend at the bottom showing which colors represent which countries. That's a
Hmm.
common technique that's been used for a long time. But actually, it's almost easier if you put those labels right on the lines themselves. In the chart on the right, you can see the labels on the right.
Mm-hmm.
All of those lines could have the same color, and you'd still be conveying that same information to someone.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of thing you want to keep in mind when you're showing something, that the exact way you'll implement the chart is sort of based on what your message is going to be.
It's like, oh, it seems like really small changes can make a huge difference. Like you mentioned, putting the legend down at the bottom versus on the side there. And with that, actually, Eric checks in with just a really interesting question on this point. So Eric asks, what are your thoughts on packing one chart with data versus creating multiple charts to get the point across? My team continually seems to want more and more in a view, which I advise against due to visual overload.
Wow, that's an excellent question, and I'm with you, Eric. I'm with Eric. A sequence of charts, each of which clearly makes a point, and allows you to move on to the next one and make another point. I think that's much better than putting too much into a chart. And there is a way to tie those charts together. So for instance, here we've got this color scheme sort of based on the colors in the flags of the countries. If we move to another chart and we're showing data from the same countries, you want to be sure to keep some things consistent so the viewer can track what's happening from one chart to the next. So Turkey would be red in the next chart as well, for example. That's a good question.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. I hope we answered your question. I'll let you continue, Ben.
Oh, that's okay. But another type of data that's not numerical is the categorical data. And here it's the different crops that are being produced in Turkey back in 2016. And so one of the things you can do, instead of trying to have columns, which columns look nice, but it's hard to put labels of categories underneath them. It was pretty easy to put a year, a nice short, but what we're doing here is turning that on its side, and then the length of the line once again represents the production. Now, the sorting on the left chart is alphabetical, which makes sense, but there's no real natural order to a list of fruits and vegetables. Alphabetical is sort of overlaid onto it by our language. However, if you sorted that data to start with the highest production of a vegetable at the top and down to the lowest, you are actually adding information, adding knowledge for the viewer. There's nothing extra in the chart. It's just organized in a way that makes it more accessible. So this is good. If I asked you on the left chart which crop was the fifth largest production, it would take a while to look at those lines and decide. But if you go on the right-hand side, you could tell me pretty quickly that it's apples.
And that was actually a question, that I've had that I've been, thinking of, obviously, with, what we do. We, use a lot of charts and a lot of visuals and everything like that. And one thing that really jumped out to me was, should I put them in alphabetical order, or is it easier, like you mentioned, to put them in production amounts based off, what you had on the right side? That I feel like is something I always have trouble with constantly.
And it really depends. The chart on the left is useful if you're going to be speaking about the different crops in a sequence. You want people to be able to find them, and so the alphabetization is helpful in that regard. But if you wanted to talk about some other things, then the chart on the right might be a better choice. And we're going to see this chart again.
Perfect.
Or similar charts to it. So the second type of chart category is the composition chart, and here's one we've all seen over the years, the pie chart, which has kind of fallen out of favor for a variety of reasons. One reason is hard maybe to appreciate, but is really the most important, which is that the brain is not as good at comparing the sizes of these different pie wedges as it is with rectangles that are standing next to each other. Another is that it can be hard to label these. If you started getting really thin slices and you were trying to put label each of them, it's going to be very difficult to fit them in there. So there are some options that are much better than this, and they let you do additional things. So here we're stacking these rectangles to show the same information, and we have the advantage of being able to do that over a sequence of years. So not only are you seeing how the production in any one country changes, but the overall production is also available to you as the height of the stack. And as we did with the first comparison chart, we can have a line version of it where we fill in the area underneath and call it an area chart to show that if there are more categories being, not categories, but data points being portrayed.
And I'd be interested to know, just kind of looking at those last two charts there, obviously the one on the left and the one on the right, how important is it to understand the psychology of our viewers? So understand, like you mentioned, that pie charts have fallen out of favor, and maybe you might need to take a different approach. How critical is that to know essentially how your viewers will perceive the charts?
Well, that's a good thought. I guess I haven't worried too much about that. I try to focus on I assume that I will. Well, let's see. This is a good question. It may not be fair, but I assume that the way the chart looks to me, if I put it down and come back the next day and look at it fresh, does it tell me what I'm trying to say? That I'm a good test. But you probably should show it to some other people. If you really are putting together some very important charts, let's say they're going into an annual report or some advertisement or something, and they're going to be seen by a lot of people, you should be showing them to quite a few people and then asking them questions like, what information did you get? What was the first thing you noticed? Did you have any questions while you were looking at it? Was there any point of confusion? And then iterate in the creation of your chart, because it's very unlikely that the first draft you make of one is going to be as good as it could possibly be. And people can really help you refine that. You just have to be humble enough to be willing to ask. And some of those questions are, you might not think of them, but if someone says, I was wondering this as I looked at it, maybe that's something you could add to the chart to give it even more value. That's certainly the most important thing, is if they got confused. You want to eliminate that if you can.
Very true. And just as kind of a quick follow-up, Albert checks in kind of along this same line. So Albert asked, what are your thoughts about adding data labels to show the values along with the legend name, since people sometimes have difficulty reading across the chart vertically and horizontally?
That's an excellent point, and that is covered in the course, and I have a slide on that later.
Perfect.
You can be helping your viewer, because they don't have to be looking around for things, especially if it's a number that they might have to calculate, like if it's all between two of the grid lines. But you could also be distracting them if the numbers aren't important. If it's more the relationship between the values. Oh, I can see that this one's twice as much as that one. It doesn't matter if they're 1 ton and 2 tons or 10 tons and 20 tons. The fact that their one is twice as large as the other is, if that's your message, you don't need the numbers. I mean, you should always have numbers on the axes, but you don't have to use the grid lines like over on the left, perhaps.
Perfect. Albert,
good question.
Thank you for that, Albert. I'll let you continue.
Sure. Well, we have 2 more categories to take a quick look at here. The distribution chart shows you if you have a bunch of data points. In this case, they're the ages of drivers that got traffic tickets in New York City. I don't remember when, but you can portray the distribution using a histogram like this. So the total number of tickets given to 16-year-olds is portrayed by the height of the first bucket on the left. And you can see that the heights climb up quickly, as the insurance companies know, till you're in your early 20s, and then they taper off. And you can change the sizes of these buckets. You can have them be 5-year buckets. If the story you wanted to tell didn't require this much granularity. And you can do something clever here. You could actually have a stacked histogram. So the tickets given to men are shown in blue, and the ones given to women are shown in the pink. I apologize for the stereotypical colors, but it does show that women are less likely to get tickets, and good for them. But it takes up no more space. It's still one chart. It's not that hard to discern the extra information, and you've provided almost twice as much interest in this chart, I would say.
Interesting.
So Here we've got data in two different dimensions, and they're being contrasted to each other. They aren't really related to each other. Along the x-axis is the production in tons of potatoes in some European countries, and then the y-axis, it's the production of grapes. And what we're able to see by this distribution within the rectangle of the chart is that there's a group of countries that produced almost no grapes, but they produced quite a few potatoes. And if you look at the list of them, Belgium, United Kingdom, Germany, they're northern countries. So it's not surprising. It'll make sense to someone when they read that list. And then over in the bottom left, you've got some countries that produce both crops, but in small quantities. And then in the top, there's a couple countries that produce large quantities of both. These countries, we can assume, are probably exporters of these crops. And so you could tell a story like that by adding these color blocks around groupings in your distribution. So I'll go on to the last category, the relationship charts. This is where there is some kind of correlation between the values in one part of your data with values in another part of your data, and you want to depict that in a way that people can see easily. So this chart is about the sort of the productivity, the efficiency of potato production in various European countries. So along the x-axis, we've got the number of thousands of hectares that are in service producing that crop. And then on the y-axis is the amount of that crop that was produced. And the blue line, which was calculated by the software, is the average, the trend line of that data. And you can see that some countries are right on the line, and then some are above and some are below. And Romania, for example, is very inefficient at producing potatoes over the land that they use. And Poland is somewhat inefficient as well. So you could tell that story that perhaps a more modern, non-former Eastern Bloc country tends to have more efficient production.
Awesome.
And one more, I think, in this category, that was a linear relationship, but the relationships don't have to be linear. This is a nonlinear, and it's a inverse relationship, we would say. So it's about how many children are born in countries based on their GDP. So along the x-axis, we have the gross domestic product. The richer countries are to the right, and the poorer countries are to the left. And you can see that there are more children born in the countries with a lower GDP. Not making a judgment here; it's simply a correlation that you can demonstrate through this display of the statistics. So those are the four main categories. That's not to say that there aren't others. There's charts that actually take the form of maps, and there's some other interesting charts you will encounter, and you should put them into your toolkit if you think that they'd be helpful to you. But they may actually fall within one of these categories. I just didn't show every single kind of chart that has been invented.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, the baseball charts where they have the hot and cold areas for hitters. I'm tragically a Mets fan, but
that's taking the histogram and taking it up one dimension. So you've kind of got histograms in two dimensions. It's called a heat map.
Cool.
And you use a color to show the intensity, the number of samples that fit within that that cell of the grid.
That's so interesting. I love that. And, now that we're talking about the different types of, graphs and charts and everything like that, Callahan actually checks in with a very interesting question along this line. So Callahan wanted to know, in what ways do you design or change a graph when putting together information when trying to make a persuasive argument versus just distributing the information in a meeting?
That is possibly something that I would move up to the higher level of where you've got a series of charts and you're building an argument, a logical argument, and that's not something that I've had to do very often. Oftentimes, if you're writing, come more from academia, where you write a paper and you your words in the paper are going to be making your argument, and the chart just has to sort of line up with that.
Mhm.
But in a meeting, you really, my goal would be, in a perfect world, you wouldn't have to have any bullet points on your slides. You just put up a chart in each slide and you talk about it. The chart would have a title, and it would only try to tell a little bit of information, and it would be very clear, and then the next one would build upon that. And you could put this into a book, or just people could come across it later and still be able to make sense out of it, even though you're not there anymore. I think that's one problem. If someone gives you the PowerPoint slides and it wasn't super well organized, they're just a bunch of words, and you forget what it was that they actually said. Whereas the chart can keep saying that for you, a series of charts in particular, telling a story.
Very true, very true. And as just a quick follow-up, I want to know, how do you balance the need for simplicity and clarity with the desire to create something that's, visually appealing? So like you said, kind of getting away from the pie charts. How do we balance that?
Well, it's a tricky thing because I guess in the early days when features were being added to the chart making software, you'd have the ability to do things that really weren't very conducive to making the information available to the viewer. They would just sort of clutter things up. So some of the no-nos are to use three-dimensional shapes and background colors and all kinds of things that might distract the viewer. And so I honestly don't try to be fancy at all. I take the color palette that the software is giving me, except in some of the examples you saw where I was using the colors from the country's flags, where I thought that association might be meaningful enough to warrant the color change. And then just try to focus on the content itself.
Of course. Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Ben. And I know you have a little pause for us, or a little church.
Oh, I have something I want to show you, which is so the things we just looked at are really where you should start. It's like, what do I want to say with a chart? What data do I have? Let's look at these different categories and see which one fits. Are we comparing things? Are we showing how something is composed? Or are we showing a relationship or distribution? So you've chosen your chart, and you've made your first draft of it. And now you want to make it better. And the steps to follow here involve decluttering, which we were just talking about. If for some reason your software cluttered your chart, we had a question about the necessity of grid lines and some other things. You might take some of those out to make it such that only the relevant information remained. And then the next thing to do is to accentuate the stuff that you really want to get across. And here we want to learn about something called pre-attentive attributes. So I'm going to show a slide for just maybe 2 seconds.
Okay.
And I want everyone to know this is coming so that they're looking at the screen. And then see if I'll ask you afterwards what you got from that slide. So we're ready, here we go. So my question is, what did you see? Because I didn't tell you what you should be looking for. I'm expecting, what's that? What did you see, Nick?
I was going to say, I saw a red dot. So I couldn't
right.
how many different dots. I needed maybe a little bit longer, but the red dot definitely stood out to me for sure.
Right. Well, so this wasn't a chart that you would make for someone, but it was an example, a demonstration of the way that certain graphical features will grab your attention. The lead-in slide said pre-attentive attributes. So these are attributes of things in your chart that will get your attention before you're paying attention. So you don't need to be told what to look for. It reaches out and grabs you. You have to be very careful when you're using these things, because if you put them in places where you don't really want people's attention to go, you'll be distracting them. But if you put them only where you want people to focus, you'll be drawing them right to the most important thing in your chart. I have a couple other quick examples here. We're just going to look at them quickly. So that was a color.
Okay.
That was a different shape. I'll go back there. It's actually pretty easy. I mean, it's not like, oh, I couldn't find it. The question is, how quickly did it grab your attention? And then this final one
Hmm.
is the size of the lower right square. So you could use combinations of this uh, pre-attentive attribute feature in your brain to tell people what to look at.
Mm-hmm.
We evolved to notice things. I was saying a little bit about this earlier. If you see something moving in the bushes, it could be
Mm-hmm.
something that you might want to hunt, or it could be something you might want to run away from. You don't, you can't afford to be thinking all the time, I wonder if there's something I can hunt. You need to know about it the instant it happens. So that's left over, even though we don't really need it in our daily life.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question in the queue that I want to ask you very quick, and it actually gets kind of to our next topic as far as, kind of colors and how important, things like that are. So Amora, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but they check in with a question asking, what can data visualization be made more accessible? So how can it be made more accessible for, say, someone who's, colorblind, for example? And I think you talked a little bit about this before, changing sizes and things like that.
Well, there's a part of the course that talks about this, and there's lots of aspects to that. If you know your audience, then you could put particular emphasis on making sure that what you do is accessible. So, in the case of color blindness, you wouldn't, if you thought that part of your audience might be colorblind, or just because you cared to make that not be an issue for them, you would avoid showing red and green things that might appear to be the same color to them. In some ways, I also think there's some other stuff, like easier stuff that you might not realize. Some people can use fonts for their labels and their titles that are too small for the people in the back of a large room.
Of course.
Or if it's a sign that's going to be on the side of a bus, you need to think about who's going to be viewing it and in what situation they'll be viewing it. So in the Western world, we tend to read our written material from the top down and left to right. But there are countries where it isn't done in that order. And so, for the English speakers, a good title right at the top tells the people what they're about to learn as they work their way down. And you don't want the next most important thing to be all the way at the bottom or over on the right. So in another country, in another culture, perhaps you would want to take that into account and do it a little differently. That's certainly important. It's not the first thing I would worry about.
Awesome. And thank you for that question, Maura. We really appreciate it. And kind of continue along this same line, in your first pre-attentive question. You showed us, the different dots, with the black and the red. So I want to know, what role does color play when we're talking about data visualization?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because the next slides that I have here are putting that pre-attentive nature to work. So here on the left, we are back to the chart with the crop production. And I mentioned before that if you wanted to talk about a crop by name and it's sorted by production, that would be a little hard for the user to find. You could help them out. If we're talking about apples, highlight the apples in a different color. It's the only one that gets a different color. You don't want to give them all different colors, just the one you want them to look at. And then over on the right, we talked about how Romania and Poland are lagging behind in their efficiency in potato production. So I've given them shades of red, the darker shade for Romania indicating even less efficiency than Poland. And so you can use these colors to draw attention and convey information. I have some more things you can do to your charts, some of which use color. Adding annotations to your chart. This kind of goes to the question that was asked earlier about additional information. The trend line over on the left helps viewers see the pattern, the overall trend of how the data is changing. It's zigzagging up and down, and it might be a little hard to see what the the median value is over all that time, but the software calculates it for you. And an annotation on the right, pointing to one of the years of Italy's production, just makes the observation, which could be the point of the chart, that this was the best year of production for any country over this time span. It's a little trite, but the idea is that if you're only putting a label on one thing and the label has the color that stands out, you're going to get attention there and you're going to convey useful information to the viewer.
And with that chart you showed with, the apples being in red, I'd be interested to know, how can we use it, and when I mean it, I'm referring to color, effectively to really convey not just information, but also emotion as well. So for instance, red being a power color, for example. How do we draw that connection?
Well, I usually use color to convey another dimension of the data. I'm not really sure I've tied into emotional manipulation or whatever you would call it. The example on the right here with Poland and Romania is sort of using the color, the chromatic color red, going from a very light shade to a dark shade to demonstrate movement in that one axis. I don't know if I have other examples of it, but it's a common technique to show a third dimension or a fourth dimension of data. Another thing you can do is to change the size of the data points as they're plotted, which you often see in maps. Big cities, large population, they're a bigger circle on the map. If it's a capital city, you might replace it with a star, a different symbol. And if you added a color, you might have green for cities that are growing or red for cities that are losing their population. You could encode information using all of those different attributes in a chart, but you run the risk of overwhelming the viewer. So.
And I'd be interested to know if if you've seen anything regarding, kind of color schemes and everything like that. So when it comes to, storytelling with some of this data, is it easier to tell it with two competing colors? So like, red and yellow or green or blue, or do some colors like, overwhelm people or make it harder to tell stories with data?
I'm not aware of that. That could be a question that psychologists have studied. This pre-attentive attribute idea comes out of psychology, so it's important to go back to the biology of humans and the psychology of how their minds work to make sure that the right principles are being applied. But I can't help you with that one.
Perfect. And just real quick, you had mentioned early on that a lot of times people try to put too much information into a chart and kind of get overwhelmed with the information. So how do you strike that balance between a, nice aesthetically pleasing graphic, but also making it functional as well?
Yeah, when I'm thinking of a larger story that I want to tell, I think I do what they do at Pixar when they're plotting out an animation. They make little index cards saying this scene, be it 1 second or 4 seconds, is going to tell this thing. It's going to show Woody grimacing or something like that. And then you've got a bunch of these cards, and in the case of charts, they would be the titles of the charts, which are the essence of the message for that chart. And then you could move those things around until you like the flow of it, and then worry about making the charts that correspond with those ideas. I realize I've been talking and I forgot exactly your question, but what was your question?
No, it was really just kind of what colors draw our attention more and everything like that. I was just curious, just with the blue and red, for example, or with the pre-attentive graphic that you use, the black and the red, that contrasting, it really helped me kind of draw my attention there and really make it easy.
Yeah, I think in certain contexts, for certain audiences, colors have meaning. So blue and red could mean cold and hot, or green and red could mean gains and losses. And so if you're talking to people who are in the financial world, those colors should be used carefully, probably more than they would be used if you're talking to someone else.
Very true.
Uh,
And you touched on a little bit of functionality and everything like that. And, you've obviously showed a bunch of different graphics. So I'd be interested to know when should we prioritize one over the other? So, for instance, putting too much information in a graphic or making a graphic or a data set very easy to read versus trying to do too much with it. How do we strike that balance?
well, I suppose there are times where you can only provide one chart.
Hmm.
If you're giving a poster presentation at a conference, for example, you don't have that much real estate,
Hmm.
and people can stand there for as long as they want, and they might be more sophisticated viewers who understand what's they're going to see. They can find things on their own more easily. So I guess I wouldn't rule out the use of such a chart.
Hmm.
It shouldn't be your starting point. You shouldn't start with a complicated chart and then
Or,
begrudgingly make it simpler. I think you should think of what you want to say, and somewhere along the line you'll find the right size, because there are things you can combine into one chart.
Mhm.
And I have actually some examples here from charts that we saw before where there's additional information that's been added. So we're back to the crop production in Turkey.
Mhm.
The same bar chart, but I've added an annotation. If my message was that three times the same amount of tomatoes are produced as the next three crops together, I've helped the viewer out here by doing the math for them, putting an annotation in. And so now there's more information in the same chart, but it's
Mhm.
not become overwhelming. It's pretty manageable, I'd say. And then over on the right, it could be hard for someone who's looking at that green graph line to know what the average value is. So I've put that in as this dashed purple line. That's the average over all the years. And then I could provide them with the number of tons above typical, above average, that peak is. Because looking at going over to the left side of the graph and doing a little bit of math, if you could even come up with a number, it would take a lot of work and it might not be the best
Mhm.
result. So you can give people more information, but I think you don't want to make it so that they have to hunt for it too much.
And we've talked a lot about color when it comes to data visualization, and I want to ask you a little bit about kind of how important pictures are and everything like that. But just real quick, Helen checks in and wants to know with a sequence of charts. So as you mentioned, when we're telling stories and everything like that with our data, she wants to know, is it important to keep some of the parts the same? So kind of keeping everything even and everything like that.
Yeah, I think before I mentioned using the same colors to represent the same items, but it's possible that you have a series of charts where you want something to be the constant and everything else is in proportion in relation to that. That would be important. Then keep the chart the same size and the same part of your screen so that people don't have to think hard. Is that the same as what I was just looking at? It's obvious. And then they can now evaluate the relationship between the rest of what's on that chart to the thing that they've now come to understand. So you can build up a multidimensional view of the data by keeping one axis the same. Another thing I might do is if you've got three dimensions of data, let's say you were
Mhm.
drawing that nonlinear relationship, you could put that chart right above another one. You could have a chart to its left. They share common axes, and then that allows you to compare pairs of them at a time.
Mhm.
It's not a guaranteed to work, but often it can show people things that you would have a harder time seeing if you showed one chart and then the next one and the next one all in isolation.
Hmm. Perfect. Helen, thank you for that question. I hope we answered it. And getting back to kind of what I was asking you before, we talked a lot about, colors and color schemes like that. So I really want to know, what role does pictures play when we're trying to tell a story, especially with data?
I typically don't use pictures in the charts that I make. They can draw someone's attention a little too much. They
Mhm.
start looking too much at the pictures of what is that? It's a little thing. Oh, it's so and so character. I love that character. And
Mhm.
now they're not thinking about what you want them to think about.
Mhm.
In limited use, in a simple graphical fashion, certain iconography
Hmm.
can if you had a chart that talked about motion picture studios, and you had a Disney icon and you had MGM or whatever, you could probably convey things more easily than if you were writing out the words and people actually had to read them. So there's a line above which something that's too complicated or too busy is probably going to detract more than it's going to help.
And one thing you mentioned earlier, you mentioned, 3D things and 3D charts and everything like that. Is it appropriate to use 3D charts? And, when should we think, okay, maybe kind of let's expand this chart and make it three-dimensional?
Well, I was being a party pooper earlier on some of the whiz-bang stuff that is in the software. So what I was talking about there with 3 dimensions was the sort of 2.5 dimensions. So some shape that is now, instead of a square, it's a block, and it's casting a shadow, and it's transparent and all that. It's getting in the way of seeing your data. But you are making a very good point that we're looking at data in a 2-dimensional representation here. It is possible to plot data along 3 axes at once, or to, in some other way, render it in a 3D spatial view. And if that is something that works for your data, it's more of a scientific or a medical kind of display usually, then by all means, go ahead and use that. You probably want to limit some of the other things like annotations. Maybe just point here, this is the cancer, or whatever, but not too much other, because it's hard enough for a lot of people to make sense of something that they're seeing that's in 3 dimensions. But there's a lot of value there. A third dimension that can be used as well is to rotate a data set. Actually, that's sort of a 4th dimension if you think about it. That's almost a different field, I would say. Scientific visualization is often what that is referred to as. And the things we're talking about here, I believe, are mainly for presenting information, for education or explanation. Although a lot of the techniques also work for exploration. So if you've got data and you want to know what's in it, are there any patterns here that I could find by tweaking some of the parameters of the way I'm making the chart? You'd still want to use some of these same ideas so that the chart is legible and not too cluttered when you do that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben. And I know you have another chart that you want to show us. I want to make sure we get to it.
Sure. I've got a series of charts, which is from the 3rd course about, so the 1st course is how to make a chart. What chart should you use? 2nd course is making it impactful, getting it to be clear and emphasizing the things you want the viewer to see. And the 3rd course is about telling a story. Typically, that's with multiple charts. And I'm not telling a story exactly here, but I needed a data set to work with that could be used in some depth. And I've encountered electricity demand and usage, production data in the country, and also specifically in Texas and the Pacific Northwest. And I found it to be really a lot of fun to look at. So I think it gives a good example of using multiple charts to tell different aspects of the same story. So I'll start off here. This is nationwide data from 2019 showing the demand for electricity across the country for 1 year. And you can see that the red line is a moving average. And as you might guess, in the wintertime, there's more need for electricity for heating. And then in the summertime in particular, there's great need for electricity for air conditioning. But you'll see that in the pink shaded area, there's a faster moving period of up and down. And what that correlates to is the work week. The days in the middle of the week use more electricity. People are in offices and businesses. And then on the weekends, there's much less use. So here we're looking at it at a year level. But if we zoom in a bit, this is a period of a little over 2 weeks. Now that those little pink humps from the previous chart are the red line, the moving average between the days. And you can still see the weekends, the low points. But now we can see that within each day, there's a pattern as well. And it corresponds possibly with the businesses being opened or with air conditioning being needed. This is in the springtime. or just people being awake and doing things. So these two charts together show you something that would have been very hard to show in a single chart. There's zooming in and out can be very helpful. And this is another look at the year-long electricity demand. And here I'm showing it in two different locations, on the top in Texas and the bottom in the Northwest. And I've sort of arbitrarily colored the high usage times with red. So once again, you can see the week patterns in there, the week-long humps. And what we see, though, is that in Texas, summertime is the time of big demand. And that's not surprising. It's very hot there, a lot of need for air conditioning. And then in the Pacific Northwest, it's the wintertime where people need to heat their homes a bit. So we were talking a little bit ago about the showing two charts that share an axis in relationship to each other. You can do a comparison between them. This is an example of that. So this is zooming in then to the daily level, and I found this interesting because in Texas, we have this tall peak every day, which is like probably 1, 2 o'clock, where the sun has been shining and it's just gotten to be boiling hot. This is, oh, it's May again. Maybe it's just hot in May there. I don't know. Maybe what we're seeing with some of these truncated days is a cloudy day or a rainy day. But in the Pacific Northwest, all the days are like that. They all look like molars, your teeth. They don't get to that high peak. They sort of line up more with the hours when everyone's awake and the demand is more equal. And one of the reasons I wanted to show the demand is that it leads into the question of, well, how do we supply the electricity to meet that demand? If it's changing so much over the course of the day and over the course of the year, how do we meet that demand? So this chart is one of my favorites that tries to depict in a way that people can understand where the electricity comes from. Now, the bottom green layer is from nuclear power, and it shouldn't surprise you that it's very steady straight across. You don't just flip a switch and turn a nuclear plant off. They're on until they're not, and then they're off for a while. So that's a steady baseline. The next two above that, the light blue is wind power and the yellow is solar power. So here you can see I've tried to use some color matching that people might associate with the different sources. It shouldn't be any surprise that the yellow, the solar power, is only generated in the daytime. And the wind power was a little surprising to me because it's generated throughout the day, but the peaks of windiness actually are in the nighttime. And that complements the solar very nicely. So together, they're sort of providing an even supply. The great thing about the solar generation is that it happens when you really, really need more electricity to take care of the air conditioning. Of course. And this is from a week in August back in 2019. And then the next layer above that is the hydroelectric layer. They don't have as many dams down in Texas as they do up in the Northwest. But what surprised me when I looked at this is that it doesn't produce a consistent amount of electricity every day. It never occurred to me that you don't have to just let the water run through the dam. They can actually hold it back and release it when it's needed in the middle of the day. So I'm saying this because it was a realization to me as I first plotted the data that there were things here that I didn't know, but I could see right away, and I could explain easily to someone else. So I think I could talk for quite a long time about this chart. Let me just quickly get through the last two parts of it. The gray area is coal production, and the pink is the natural gas. And you can see that those are the two that are really making up the big difference between the varying demand at different times of the day. You can't just push a bunch of electricity into the grid and have it sit there waiting to be needed. You have to make it when it's needed. So there has to be something that's flexible and that you can call upon. You can't call upon solar energy at night. So anyway, I think that this chart uses color and lets you tell multiple stories. I don't have any annotations here, but you could certainly put them in or have multiple copies of the same chart with different annotations on them telling different parts of that story. I just wanted to quickly go back to show that in that previous chart, we were looking at the hydroelectric generation in Texas. Here we are in the Northwest, and what I'm seeing is that water release we were talking about actually has a shape like your molars, very similar to the shape we saw in the demand. So they're managing this release in a way that corresponds directly to the need. And I think that if you show those two charts, you can make that point rather easily with the graphics, whereas if you were just looking at numbers, it might not be so easy. This is a final chart, and it's not that important, but it's just showing over time how the sources, the use of different sources for generating electricity have changed. There's a slight increase in solar and in wind use. Not surprisingly, hydro and nuclear are staying the same. They aren't building nuclear plants. They don't have new rivers. But the big change is up top, where natural gas is increasing and coal is decreasing. And so, anyway, there's lots of different aspects to a story you might want to tell, and different types of charts can help you tell that. Depends on what it is you want to say. Unfortunately, that means you need to learn about all the charts and have them in your toolkit so that when you need them, you know what they can do for you.
Very true. And with the different kinds of charts and telling a story, I'd be interested to know what are some common mistakes that people make and some things that people should avoid, especially when they're trying to tell a story through data using multiple charts.
Well, as we were discussing earlier, inconsistencies between the charts can cause the viewer to be stopped in their tracks. They have to start again, and they're losing the continuity that you're trying to maintain. If you have any chart I find that if any of them is a lot more difficult to consume than the others, you could lose the audience at that point. This is what happens if you've ever had a math class in college. You're following along until suddenly you missed something or you got distracted, and now you've lost the train of what they're saying. And the rest of the stuff doesn't follow as easily for you. So if each chart is another value to having simpler charts, is people could get back on track. Okay, I missed that one point, but I'm back now. I know what we're talking about, and I can pay attention to the rest of this. I don't have to tune out.
Perfect. And just very quickly, I'd be interested to know, we've talked a lot about different charts and everything like that, and you mentioned the pie chart kind of fading into the background a little bit. So I just really quickly want to know, what future trends do you see emerging in the field of, data visualization, and how should professionals really prepare for them?
That's interesting. I'm not sure that my experience is close enough to the field of how people are actually using these. I think it'll be driven by the needs of the consumers. One of the things you've seen in recent years are interactive dashboards, which would have a series of charts, and there'll be sliders on them or check boxes or whatever, where you can filter the data. Show me this region's sales numbers over this time frame. You can change those things, and that allows people to control what they see within what you want to make available to them. And I think that is a big advance that will probably continue as there are new ways introduced to let you do your own exploration. So it's not a static chart. It's like a little environment, a little playpen sandbox where you can hunt around and find out what you want to discover. That used to be impossible to have sort of off the shelf. You'd have to be a programmer probably to do that. And we don't want everyone to have to be programmers. So
Very true. Well, Ben, thank you so much. And just very quickly before we wrap, if you could kind of reach out to our audience, give them one piece of advice or one thing to think about as they're, kind of getting back to work and trying to figure out, how can I use this data to tell a story? What's that one thing you would want them to know, or one thing to take away?
Well, I don't know why people make charts. I make them usually because I want to see something, but I know that sometimes you're asked to make a chart by somebody else.
Of course.
Do not let that person say, make me a chart showing this data. That is not enough information. Before you walk out of the room, find out what do you want it to say. What message do you want to send? And then draw a line and say, I'll take care of the rest. And they'll probably be happy with what you produce. But if it's just a vague show the data thing, that's not going to end well.
Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Audience, thank you so much for joining us. Just before we go, real quickly, we have a QR code that you can scan. Just, we want to know kind of how we did. Give us a little bit of feedback, and we do read your responses, so we really appreciate that. Again, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Audience, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next keynote. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.